introduce Mike Skinner, who is, well, we asked some of the Ford family to talk this evening, and they said, and I think they're absolutely right, Mike Skinner knows more about the Ford family than the Ford family does. I call him a Fordophile. So he has a Bachelor of Science in Management from Wayne State and an MBA in Human Resources. So he doesn't work for the Ford Motor Company. He has, but he said he got laid off. He's been 15 years with his current company as Human Resources Director. He is a past president of the Dearborn Historical Society and also a past president and honorary member of the Grosse Pointe Historical Society. He is currently president of the Henry Ford Heritage Association, and he's a guide at the Henry Ford Estate at Fairlane since 1977. Were you in high school then?
Yeah, I wish. No, college, no, freshman.
And he is a board member for the Ford Piquette plant. That was Henry Ford's first big plant, and he's trying to save it and loves to take people on tours of that. But if you go on tour with Mike, just be sure you set aside the whole day. But he is our reigning Ford expert, Mike Skinner.
Thank you. Well, it's always a pleasure to speak about Ford, but it's a real honor to be speaking at the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House on this topic. Well, let's go ahead and go right into the program. I've got a few handouts afterwards, but let's see if we can get this. Lights, please. In 1991, when Life magazine polled almost 100 scholars as to who they would rate as the most important individuals of the 20th century, only 3 people were on that list unanimously. That included the Wright brothers and Henry Ford. In 1993, Time magazine ranked Mr. Ford as the 20th century's second greatest man behind Sigmund Freud. I'll ask you to think of the implications of that, but discuss it with yourselves. Don't mention it out loud, okay? In 1997, more than 100 U.S. history professors rated Mr. Ford as the third most significant American of the 20th century. And in October of 1998, Life magazine ranked Mr. Ford as the 15th most important man of the millennium. The selection based on the number of people affected by the nominee and the extent to which he or she changed daily life. Given this criteria, Mr. Ford, amongst the billions of people that have inhabited the earth the last 1,000 years, is outranked by only Edison, Columbus, Luther, Galileo, Da Vinci, Newton, Magellan, Pasteur, Darwin, Jefferson, Shakespeare, Napoleon, and unfortunately Hitler. Also, in the year 2000, Fortune magazine named Mr. Ford the businessman of the 20th century. Another measure of Mr. Ford's greatness is the continuous press references to industrial leaders and others as the Henry Ford of this company, this country, or this sphere of activity. Now, Mr. Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, his birthplace in Springwells Township, on what is now the southeast corner of Ford Road, named after his father, William, and Greenfield Roads. The 1876 Wayne County Centennial Atlas contained this illustration of his farm. So rumors that he was poor really are not really true. He came from a middle-class Midwestern farm family. On January 1st of 1885, probably the night before, December 31st, Ford attended a party, a New Year's Eve party, obviously, at the Martindale House in Greenfield Township, now part of the west side of Detroit. Here he met Clara Jane Bryant. Clara later told her parents that he was quiet, pleasant, and keen. They were engaged on April the 19th of 1886, and were married on April 11th, 1888, which was her 22nd birthday, by the way. Her mother finally allowed her to marry Mrs. Ford, or Clara Jane Bryant. By the way, over 50 years later, Mr. Ford who referred to Clara as the believer, said of his wife, quote, "If I were to die and come back in another life, I would want the same wife," unquote. Mr. and Mrs. Ford moved to Detroit on September 25th, 1891, when Henry Ford accepted a position as an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company of Detroit. And Mr. Ford is in the light-colored coveralls, third from the right at the back. He was allowed to use a small machine shop or workshop at the rear of the plant on Washington Boulevard, his second location, the last location. for personal experimentation. The Ford's only child, Edsel, was born on November 6, 1893. Shortly afterwards, the Fords moved to 58 Bagley Avenue in Detroit, and in December of that year, just 3 weeks after Edsel's, I'm sorry, that isn't correct. They did. They moved December 1st of that year, and then he was promoted December 1st also to chief engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company of Detroit. His pay increased to an impressive $100 a month. After an initial test of his first engine on the kitchen sink at Bagley Avenue, with 6-week-old Edsel sleeping in the next room, Mr. Ford's work moved to the shed behind the home, where he completed his first car, the quadricycle, on June 4th of 1896. He not only did not invent the automobile, but he also was not the first person to drive a car on the streets of Detroit, as Charles Brady King had done so on March 6th of that year, almost 3 months earlier. Does anybody know what happened in Detroit 2 days later? June 6th of 1896. Who was born on June 6, 1896? Eleanor Clay, of course. In August of 1896, Mr. Ford attended a convention of the Association of Edison Illuminating Companies in New York. Here he was introduced to Thomas Alva Edison as the young man who's made a gas car. After responding to a dozen questions about the car, Mr. Edison is said to have slammed his fist down on the table saying, "Young man, that's the thing, you have it, the self-contained unit, carrying its own fuel with it, keep with it," unquote. This encouragement led to an idolization that continued well beyond Edison's death in 1931. Years later, Mr. Ford said, quote, "That bang on the table was worth worlds to me. No man up to then had given me any encouragement." By the way, this is not Mr. Ford, this is not Mr. Edison, this is Diego Rivera's painting of a composite of Mr. Ford and Mr. Edison. If you head towards Woodward Avenue and look to your right as you're heading into the Great Hall, or the Walter Buell Ford, the second Great Hall, that his painting is down on the right-hand side. On August 15th of 1899, Mr. Ford resigned from Edison, and after his first company, the Detroit Automobile Company, failed. After less than 6 months, he took up automobile racing, and on October 1st of 1901, he entered one of the first automobile races in Michigan. It was held in Grosse Pointe Township, but really closer to what is now Chalmers and Jefferson in Detroit, but was then Grosse Pointe Township, and he was pitted against Alexander Winton, America's leading race car driver. The victory in this race led to the incorporation of Mr. Ford's second company, the Henry Ford Company, on November 30th of 1901. Failure of this company, which was reformed under Henry Leland as Cadillac motor, led Mr. Ford to a partnership with Alexander Malcolmson in August of 1902. This is the Malcolmson Coal Company main office, where Hart Plaza is now, where the state historic marker for the founding of the Ford Motor Company is located today. This is August of 1902. It evolved into the Ford Motor Company, and the papers of incorporation were signed at this site on June 16th of 1903. I cannot overemphasize Mr. Malcolmson's importance to the founding of the Ford Motor Company. He attracted most of the stockholders, including his uncle, John Gray, the president of the German Detroit Bank, and Mr. Gray became the company's first president, and Mr. Cousins, in order to watch over Mr. Ford and the company, set up his clerk, James Cousins, who was also an original stockholder, as the business manager for the Ford Motor Company. Ford expert Dr. David L. Lewis says of Mr. Cousins, quote, "His contributions, as much as Mr. Ford's, led to the Ford Motor Company's early success. Without Cousins' business acumen and drive, like dozens of other turn-of-the-century, 20th century obviously, automakers, the Ford Motor Company likely would have sputtered quickly into oblivion." Very much so. If it hadn't been for Malcolmson and Cousins, Henry Ford would probably have had a third company fail, the Ford Motor Company. And Cousins set up probably the first nationwide dealer organization of any automobile company in the country. As with his first two companies, Mr. Ford invested no money. Instead, he received 25.5% of the company's stock for his time, patents, and designs, the same amount that Mr. Malcolmson did. While the company was incorporated with a capitalization of $150,000, only $28,000 cash was actually gathered to start with. Original stockholders included Horace and John Dodge, who for a $10,000 investment would receive $9.9 million in dividends and $25 million for their stock in 1919, just 16 years later. The Dodge brothers, to be fair, provided all the engines and chassis and most of the transmissions for Ford in the early years, and also invested about $60,000 in machinery to do so. By the time the offer for the first Model A was received on July 15th of 1903, the company's bank account was at $223.65. The company will play up that in the Centennial, always has, but when the first car was sold to a Dr. Fennig of Chicago for $850, that wouldn't have saved the company. It was actually Albert Strelo, the owner of the Mack Avenue plant where they were renting, where the company started. The fact that he put $5,000 in the money that he had promised for his stock, that's really what turned the bank account around until they could sell more cars, which actually came pretty quickly after that. The business grew so quickly that a second floor was added to the Detroit Mack Avenue plant in October of 1903. This building burned in 1941, was replaced in 1942 by a brick building. We're going to go down, the Ford Motor Company is having all of their Centennial activities in Dearborn, but on June 17th, the 100th anniversary of the date that the Ford Motor Company Papers of Incorporation reached Lansing and were approved by the state government, we're going to have a temporary marker dedication at this site. So we went down to talk to the owner. Within the last 2 months, a for sale sign went up, and 2 weeks ago the building burned down. So we're not really asking anybody, we're just putting a marker up at this point. On January 12th of 1904, Mr. Ford set the world speed record on the cinder-covered ice of Lake St. Clair near New Baltimore, covering the course at 91.37 miles an hour. This event, which was featured in company advertising, led to national recognition of the company's products. Meanwhile, on October 22nd of 1903, the Ford Motor Company was sued by the Association of Automobile Manufacturers and its leader, George B. Selden, who held a patent on a road carriage and was charging 1.25% royalty on every car that was sold in the U.S. Mr. Ford and company secretary James Couzens characterized the Ford Motor Company as a little company fighting the trust. The publicity from the suit made Ford the best-known automobile in the United States, and Couzens later said, quote, the suit was probably better advertising than anything else we could put out, unquote. And by 1907, Ford Motor Company became the leading automobile producer in the world. About the same time, work began on the Model T. The first Model T was assembled on September 27th of 1908 and shipped out of the Paquette plant on October 1st of 1908. Mr. Ford incorporated into this car all of the qualities he thought were important. The vehicle was strong. I always think of Volkswagen Beetles when I see this. The vehicle was strong, durable, dependable, economical, and technically advanced. It had vanadium steel. This is not a normal Model T, but I tried to give you some of the more interesting photographs I had in my collection. Yet simple in design and priced within the reach of the largest number of potential buyers. Mr. Ford said of his creation, and you've all heard this in recent commercials, I will build a motor car for the great multitude, constructed of the best materials by the best men to be hired. My wife's a chief engineer at Ford. Always loves that line. After the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise, so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's open spaces, unquote. Mr. Ford maintained that he gained at least 1,000 customers every time that he dropped the price by $1. During the vehicle's 18-year run, he went on to prove this as first-year sales of just over 10,000 grew to 2,120,000 plus in 1923, with a price of $850 in 1908. The price by 1926 for the runabout, the cheapest model, was $260. 1923 sales represented 57% of the U.S. market and 50% of the world market. Now, the Volkswagen Beetle, as I just mentioned, the F-Series Ford truck, the Camry, and one other vehicle have passed the total production of Model Ts, 15,007,000 in North America and about 600,000 elsewhere, but never did any one model ever have 50% of the world market. And you see that fourth word down, the word Ford. There were many countries around the world that was the only English word that people knew. This is a painting I love. The Model T, as much as all other automobiles combined, created the world's greatest industry. Of course, a carburetor would work on the moon. An industry that even today provides at least one of every 10 jobs in the United States. It's also spawned better roads and the countless businesses built along them. It's been named one of the top 10 most important developments in U.S. history, and automobile historians worldwide to this day rank it as the most important automobile ever built. Model T production moved from the Paquette Avenue plant, and by the way, this is a building that in 1997 we toured. It's 56 feet wide, 402 feet long, 2 stories high, 66,000 square feet, and the owner had a nice glossy pamphlet of the one-story warehouse they were going to build on the site because it's in the Renaissance zone. The attached building to the left, you can just see a portion of it, was built by Studebaker. Ford started moving out when they started production at Island Park on January 1st of 1910, finished the move and sold it in 1911 to EMF, Everett, Meskers and Flanders, an automobile company. Mr. Flanders had actually been a production manager at Ford. They were absorbed by Studebaker, and Studebaker attached and built and attached the Albert Kahn building there next door in 1920, and Studebaker was there until 33. It was then used as a warehouse beyond that and has been owned by a number of companies. But they moved in 1910 to a 56-acre site, a former horse racing track on Woodward Avenue in Highland Park, where Ford built the biggest factory complex up to that point. I see Ken Schramm leaning out. In the bottom front is the old street railway lines across Woodward Avenue. Anyway, and we're in 1913, and this is, by the way, the summer of 1913, only a test. In Michigan, they would not have been putting the bodies on outside for any length of time in our weather. But here, Mr. Ford and his associates decided to reverse techniques used in Chicago's packing houses, where cows and pigs were disassembled on sliding conveyors. Ford would begin with small parts and sub-assembly lines and feed them into a larger assembly line. This is the gravity feed of the radiators and the wheels and tires. It would ultimately produce a completed automobile. This production revolution would cut the man-hours needed from the time they put the first line in April of 1913 until the continuous chain line was finished in January of 1914. It took the time it took to build a Model T down from 12 and a half hours to 93 minutes in just 1 year. Mass production, despite all the talk about lean production, automation, robotics, etc., remains a breakthrough of production breakthroughs to this day. In driving down manufacturing costs, the assembly line in turn enabled Mr. Ford to put into practice his next great contribution to American manufacturing after the Model T and the assembly line, that of doubling wages overnight at a period of time, reducing prices by 2/3 and cutting the workday from 9 hours to 8 hours. It's a great cartoon. Here you see all these fat cats, and it says, "Who's that in the automobile?" "Oh, him, he's the guy that sweeps out." And then this gentleman in the back of the car says, "Hawkins, would you step over to the pay window and get my wages? I quite overlooked it last week." Well, going to $5 a day wasn't quite that generous, but it was a very good move, made Ford Motor Company's workers the first industrial workers or automobile workers that could buy their own cars. But it was quite essential also, with the advent of the monotonous moving assembly line and the speed up of production. By December of 1913, turnover at the Ford plant reached 380%. In other words, they had to hire 963 people to get 100 of them to stay a year. Quoting University of Michigan professor David Lewis, who's the authority in the world on Ford, quote, "The highly publicized $5 day remains the most dramatic event in the history of wages, and will remain so until one of the largest companies in the world without advance notice again doubles wages while reducing the workday from 9 hours to 8 hours. We should not hold our breath," unquote. Mr. Ford's greatest institutional legacy is obviously the Ford Motor Company, America's first vertically integrated yet highly diversified industrial empire. Shown here is the 1,100-acre plus Rouge complex, now only partially owned by Ford. Rouge Steel, beyond the boat slips there, is a separate company. Ford controls 600 of the 1,100 acres. And in 1929 and again during World War II, there were over 100,000 people working on this site. Here, Henry Ford perfected just-in-time production, which he called inventory float, and which the Japanese later reinvented and claimed as their own name, Kanban, excuse me. In Mr. Ford's time, the company not only built cars, trucks, and tractors, it also mined coal, iron ore, and lead. Trucks and tractors, Ford was the largest producer of both at one point. The company also operated its own railroad, owned sawmills and extensive timberlands, and attempted to carve out of 2 million acres of Brazilian jungle a rubber plantation, despite the fact one of his best friends was Harvey Firestone. The company also became a major steel producer, operated a fleet of Great Lakes freighters, plus an ocean-going fleet which carried Ford cars and tractors around the world. By the way, this is the Oneida, which was torpedoed on July 13th of 1942 with a loss of 6 out of its crew of 29 extra after it had been commandeered by the U.S. government for World War II. The company was also once the world's largest airplane manufacturer, building the famed Ford Trimotor, America's largest and leading passenger plane of its day. Ford introduced the nation's first commercial airline, and over 100 airlines utilized this plane during the 1920s and early 30s. Ford also introduced the first airplane radio directional beacon at its Dearborn Airport and concrete runways. Additionally, Ford contracted with the U.S. government for the first airmail service in the U.S. from Dearborn to Cleveland and Chicago. While dwarfed by Detroit's jumbo jets, the Smithsonian has honored it as one of the 6 planes that molded commercial aviation, and this is in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, the Fordson tractor was the world's best-selling tractor by 1923, dropping to third in modern times. Tractor production in 1924 of 104,000 units represented 75% of the tractors sold that year. Unfortunately, Ford sold this division along with so many others that I've mentioned before in the 1980s and 90s. This was sold to Fiat. Ford had purchased New Holland Implement Company, and the Ford New Holland division was sold to Fiat. They've changed the name of all the old Ford tractors to New Holland now. As a preservationist, Mr. Ford had few equals. In addition to the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village, now named the Henry Ford, with its unrivaled collection of Americana, even unrivaled in many ways by the Smithsonian, he also led the effort to save one of America's oldest inns, the Wayside Inn in South Sudbury, Massachusetts, that's pictured here, and the second oldest inn in Michigan, the Botsford Inn in Farmington Hills, Michigan. His vision for Greenfield Village extended to education. He developed schools there and elsewhere in Michigan, Massachusetts. Here, if you go to the Wayside Inn, nearby is a one-room schoolhouse where the young lady that had written the poem, Mary Had a Little Lamb, went to school. Mr. Ford moved to the site and had a school there, and also in Georgia. In Georgia, there would be separate but equal schools for African Americans. And his idea was to work or to have them learn by doing and increase the students' chances of inventiveness and leadership. While many of Mr. Ford's visionary ideas are now finding increasing acceptance, soybean processing for human consumption and industrial application, when basically the crop was only used to feed livestock, turned this crop by the mid-1980s into a $13 billion agricultural industry, second only to corn. Mr. Ford regarded waste as criminal. From coal waste, he invented charcoal briquettes, and his cousin by marriage was E.G. Kingsford. He gave him the formula. If you pick up a bag of Kingsford charcoal, it still tells us the story of Henry Ford. From wood waste came cardboard, from other production waste, methane, gas, oil, and fertilizer. The Ford Motor Company even dictated the size of the boards that would go into crates for the parts that they bought for Model Ts, so that the crates could be disassembled, and without cutting the boards, they could be reassembled into the floorboards of the Model T. By the mid-1920s, the Ford salvage department was salvaging over $1 million a month. Another of the Ford Motor Company's innovations was the world's first plastic car. You can see August 13th of 1941 here with Bob Boyer, who I had the honor of meeting in 1988 on Henry Ford's 125th anniversary of his birth. And Mr. Boyer said when the car was first built, the odor was quite strong. It was like riding in a bottle of formaldehyde. Unfortunately, the advent of World War II ended this project, and of course, General Motors later came out with the Corvette. The Ford Motor Company was for decades also the leading employer of reformed alcoholics and the mentally and physically challenged. Ford set up a rehab unit at Henry Ford Hospital, as you see here, early in its existence, recognizing long in advance of general acceptance that addiction to alcohol was an illness that could be treated. Of an assistant's alcoholism, he said, quote, "This is a sickness, we're going to cure him, we'll never give up," unquote. Mr. Ford ordered that job seekers should be rejected only if they had a contagious disease. By 1919, Ford Motor Company employed over 10,000 physically impaired people, over 20% of its workforce. Ford Motor Company was also the only major employer of the era to hire African Americans into skilled trades and supervisory jobs in the 1930s. This man, for instance, and I love the cigar since Mr. Ford called cigarettes coffin nails, oversaw the work of 6 foremen and over 450 workers at the Rouge plant, many of them, most of them, I would say, white. Just as importantly, African Americans were paid the same as whites and received equal benefits. Mr. Ford, following Mr. Ford's death in 1947, the Journal of Negro History, the NAACP's publication, described Mr. Ford as, quote, "He endeavored to help humanity by offering men work at livable wages and making it comfortable for them in his employment. In this respect, he was a great benefactor of the Negro race, possibly the greatest that ever lived," unquote. While Mr. Ford, shown here with the great African-American scientist George Washington Carver, was a friend of African Americans. And by the way, if you go to Tuskegee and go to the Carver Museum, you'll find that it was dedicated by Henry and Clara Ford. And he counted several Jewish Americans as friends, such as his neighbor on Edison Avenue, Detroit Rabbi Leo Franklin, who he would give a new Model T to each year, and Albert Kahn, amongst many others as friends. He was anti-Semitic. His acceptance of a medal from Hitler's emissaries in 1938 prompted a Jewish boycott, the most complete ethnic boycott in U.S. history. Ironically, this boycott was offset by the fact that, Ken, we got a few more. It was offset by the fact that Mr. Henry Ford II, his oldest grandson, decided that he would try to make amends for that, and the family has done wonderful things for the Jewish community. Built a plant in Israel, for instance, which then led to the largest Arab boycott of any product in the world. As energy conservation becomes increasingly important, Mr. Ford can be remembered as having over 25 hydroelectrically powered mills in the 20s, 30s, and 40s that produce small automotive parts or used for soybean experimentation. All but one of the two in Milford, Michigan is standing in use today. There was one in Green Island, New York on the Hudson, in Hamilton, Ohio on the Miami, the one in the Twin Cities in St. Paul, Mississippi is still a Ford assembly plant and still partially water powered. Mr. Ford once said that with 1 foot in the land or the soil, meaning agriculture, and 1 foot in industry, America would remain strong. Production at many of these facilities was scheduled around farm planting and harvesting seasons, and all, as I say, all but the one plant in Milford of the two that were built there is still in use today. Now this is actually President Hoover lighting the fireplace in the Logan County Courthouse from Illinois, where Lincoln had practiced law. But Mr. Ford's advocacy of the work ethic and rugged individualism, along with his willingness to defy even presidents, led him to refuse to support Franklin Delano Roosevelt's National Recovery Act and its insignia. An insignia, of course, was the eagle clutching a cogwheel, and Mr. Ford referred to it as Roosevelt's buzzard. While admittedly initially established by Henry and Edsel Ford to avoid inheritance taxes in 1936, the Ford Foundation still is one of the largest foundations in the world. As a matter of fact, it was the largest for over 40 years until, with a stroke of a pen, Bill Gates created a larger one. And it's given over $12 billion away, including over $800 million in 2001. General Motors Vice President of Research, Charles F. Kettering, said of Henry Ford in 1943, quote, 1,000 years from now, when the Churchills and Roosevelts are but mere footnotes in history, Henry Ford will loom as the most significant figure of our age, unquote. Meanwhile, at the time of Mr. Ford's death, General Motors Chairman Alfred P. Sloan said of him, quote, the impact of Henry Ford's inventiveness and productive genius on the well-being of America is incalculable. Calculable. I'm saying it wrong. Say it for me. Calculable. I'm sorry, thank you for coming. John Franklin Phillips, President of the Ford House. Thank you, John. I couldn't get the word out, excuse me. Will Rogers, the great humorist, once said of Mr. Ford, it will take 100 years to figure out whether he helped us or hurt us, but he certainly didn't leave us where he found us. Seen at opposite ends of this photograph, Mr. Ford's relationship with his only child, Edsel, was strained. Mr. Ford loved Edsel, but failing to remold him into the hardened image that he preferred, treated him rather harshly. Edsel was named president of the Ford Motor Company on December 31st of 1918, but he was never really given a chance to run the company by his father. This, by the way, is 1923 or 24 with Charlie Chaplin at the Highland Park plant in the Woodward Avenue powerhouse, and of course his movie Modern Times is based on his tour of the Highland Park plant. The company may have remained #1 in the mid-1920s, and if Edsel had been allowed to take charge of the company, and if he'd been in control of the company, one must wonder if such incidents as the Battle of the Overpass in 1937 would have occurred. In the center with the watch chain there is Walter P. Reuther about to be overtaken by Ford thugs. And one must wonder if Edsel Ford would have died at age 49, passing away before both of his parents in 1943. Still, Edsel Ford I was an important figure in the history of the company founded by his father. One of his strongest areas of business expertise was design. Boy, he always dressed so impeccably. This led to the design of many of the most stylish automobiles in the 1930s, when Henry Ford's idiosyncrasies included the continuous use of mechanical brakes during a period when all of their competitors had hydraulic brakes in their vehicles. The styling of Ford automobiles was one of the few redeeming features of Ford cars during this period, when Ford dropped from #1 to #3 behind General Motors and Chrysler Corporation. Also, it was Edsel Ford who led the movement to purchase the Lincoln Motor Company on February 4th of 1922. Here you see Wilfred Leland, Eleanor Clay Ford, Edsel Ford, Clara Henry, Mrs. Leland, and Wilfred's son in the lobby of the Lincoln plant, which unfortunately was just recently torn down. but the word Lincoln from above the door and those oak branches on either side were saved by the Lincoln Foundation and are currently out at Jerome Duncan Ford at Dick Duncan's private museum, which is open on Thursdays actually from 11 to 7, and will eventually go into a recreation of this front entrance of the building later on. Of this purchase of Lincoln, Edsel said, quote, "My father builds the most popular car in the world. I want to build the best car in the world," unquote. Under Edsel Ford's leadership, this Ford division, Lincoln, built some of the most beautiful automobiles, including the Lincoln Continental. It has been ranked as the 6th best designed mass product of modern times, and Frank Lloyd Wright, who owned one, said it was the most beautiful car ever built. Even today, Henry Ford II casts a long shadow over the company he founded. Controversial, paradoxical, colorful, he was an enigma, an idealist, pioneer. In some respects, he was cynical, reactionary in others. He had a selfish, mean, even cruel streak, yet much more often he was generous, kind, and compassionate. He was narrow-minded and stubborn, yet at times he displayed a remarkable insight, vision, and open-mindedness and flexibility. Now we've seen how Henry Ford, in the minds of most people, was the Ford Motor Company for the first 40 years, but his grandson and successor, Henry Ford II, pictured to the left with Edsel to the right, also largely personified the company then for the next 3.5 decades, and was identified with the firm until his death in 1987. The man seen here with Henry Ford II has told us what he thinks of Henry Ford, has he not? And everyone around the world who has read his biography believes everything that Iacocca ever said. But it's been long evident to the well-informed people that Iacocca's memoir was largely written to massage an enormous ego and partly to seek revenge for having been terminated by Henry Ford II. In any event, he had great careers at Ford and Chrysler, and he should be given much credit for the things that happened to the Ford Motor Company in the 1960s and 70s, although he did not design the Mustang. As for Henry Ford II, let's credit him for being dutiful. He could have been like John Duval Dodge, whose excesses led to a disinheritance from his father John, or Horace Elgin Dodge Jr., who despite success in boat building and racing years, was a playboy and married 5 times, or Walter P. Chrysler Jr., just an out-and-out art collector. Not that that's bad. But nonetheless, by age 26 in 1943, following his father's death and his 80-year-old grandfather's resumption of the Ford presidency, he was released from the Navy to help join the family company. Becoming president at age 28, he cleaned house, hired a mentor, Ernest R. Breach, from the Bendix division of General Motors, and got the company back on track. Henry Ford II worked hard, putting the business first and foremost throughout his long career, many say to the detriment of his personal life and relationships. But he was not totally a slave to his work, tempering work with play, developing a balance that most people envy. Initially, Mr. Ford deferred with a much more mature Breach, but within a dozen years he was fully capable of administering the company, and Mr. Breach, acknowledging the fact, bowed out in 1960. No one to ever equivocate Mr. Ford gathered facts, listened, and acted decisively, although it seemed sometimes arbitrarily. He was right most of the time, though, and he also made mistakes, as all decision makers do. Much to his credit, he always accepted and quickly admitted those errors. How many people can we say that do that at the tops of companies? This, of course, is the almost annual portrait first in the Schaefer Road administration building, then in the Glass House of Henry Ford II, Benson, and William Clay Ford Sr. Mr. Ford was a generalist, not a specialist. He had a strong continuing interest in overseas operations, long neglected by executives preoccupied with a big, prosperous U.S. market. Here he's seen with German Chancellor Adenauer. Slide tray change, Ken, thank you. Yep, go right ahead, lift it off. Just lift it right off, go ahead. Oh, you know what? You need me to move it one more forward, don't you? I'm sorry. You can leave all those in there, Ken, that's fine, yeah. We set? We are set. Increasingly, Mr. Ford channeled some of the company's best brains abroad, promoted statewide those who produced, and saw to it that international operations were encouraged and adequately funded. Here he's with King Juan Carlos of Spain at the Valencia, Spain plant where the Fiesta was built. I had one that made it to 128,000, another one that made it to 108,000 miles. Wonderful little car. Mr. Ford was also an excellent judge of managerial personnel. This is Philip Caldwell, his immediate successor as chairman, and a man who deserves much more credit for the success and turnaround of the company in the 1980s than he receives today. Mr. Ford did bet on some men that didn't work out, Bunky Knudsen for one, although I believe to a large extent this was the fault of Mr. Iacocca and his supporters. But more importantly, he advanced the careers of many winners, including Donald Peterson, chairman from 1985 to 1989. His retirement, by the way, on March 1st of 1989 was characterized as voluntary. In his quote in the 1989 annual report, he called it a, quote, a very orderly transition. Later, though, it became obvious and has been in a number of books that he was asked to leave after blocking the advancement of Henry Ford II's son, Edsel Ford II, and William Clay Ford Jr. from the board of directors. Harold Red Poling succeeded Peterson as chairman from 1989 to 1993, and Red Poling was then replaced by Alexander Trotman, who retired as chairman in 1998. This is the famous picture from 1995 when they were coming up with the Ford 2000 plan. William Clay Ford Jr. Was named chairman effective January 1st of 1999. Unfortunately, at the same time, Jack Nasser became president and CEO. We'll pass right over that. All in all, Henry Ford II bequeathed a rich legacy. I hear the Chrysler people in the back laughing. Bequeathed a rich legacy of talent upon his retirement in 1979, and he carefully monitored the talent during his remaining 8 years of life. In order to maintain Ford family oversight after Henry Ford II's retirement, William Clay Ford Jr. Very deservingly became vice chairman, a position that he would hold until March 9th of 1989, after his son William Clay Ford Jr. and nephew Edsel Ford II had been named to the board. Mr. William Clay Ford Sr. is still a director of the company since 1948. And this is kind of interesting. I could see myself giving the owner of my company a clock for his 35th anniversary of the company, but that's what's going on right here with Mr. Caldwell doing so. Henry Ford II was candid and honest. He did not tolerate those who did not do their homework, and few tried to deceive him. Still, he was not a tyrant. On the contrary, he valued and rewarded professionalism wherever he found it. This is the 150 millionth Ford vehicle, as you can see, with William Clay Ford, Philip Caldwell, and Henry Ford II signing the hood of that car at the Dearborn Assembly Plant. He also continued to build bridges with African Americans, as his grandfather had done from the time that he joined the company. This is 1945. It's interesting to note the cigarettes, because Henry Ford I is still living, but it probably was off the company grounds on Miller Road. And he received awards from African Americans for the service to them, and he mended fences with Jews, as I mentioned before. He tried very hard to revitalize downtown Detroit, and certainly the Renaissance Center. Ironically, now General Motors' global headquarters would never have been built without him. A half century from now, it seems safe to assume that Henry Ford II will have an honored place in automobile history. The oldest of, and the second largest of America's surviving automakers, Ford prospered from the outset, going on to the history of the company, moving on from the leaders. After his founding, the Ford Motor Company quickly began to expand outside the United States. Ford of Canada was organized on August 17, 1904, and the first Canadian-built Fords were built, of course, in Windsor, Ontario, here across the river. Ford of Canada went on to become the British Empire's largest automobile manufacturer during the next 3 decades. By 1909, the parent company had appointed sales agents in 11 European countries and in Australia, and 11 assembly plants were built overseas between 1919 and 1926. It can also be said that Ford was the first U.S. automobile maker to assemble cars in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and reportedly is the first in the world, although I'm not certain of that. One of its plant locations was Japan, where the Model Ts were popular as taxicabs, especially after Tokyo's massive 1923 earthquake. Despite some hazardous driving conditions in Chile, the company was particularly successful in Latin America, where Ford car sales exceeded those in all of continental Europe by 1926. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the company built the Dagenham plant, pronounced how? Oh, I thought you corrected me, I'm sorry. Dagenham, outside London, its largest manufacturing complex outside the United States on the Thames River, of course, and its sizable Cologne plant went into production in 1931. As did its large Windsor factory complex. The smokestacks that you see there in the distance are those that when you reach the Scott Fountain end of Belle Isle are still directly across from you. Meanwhile, during World War I, the company was a major military supplier, producing Liberty engines that you see here, Canadian-built ambulances in large numbers, submarine chasers, also called eco-boats, and what is now the Dearborn Assembly Plant, where the Mustang has always been built, many cars before it, which will be torn down as soon as the new truck plant is finished and the Mustang moves to the the former Mazda operation at Flat Rock, and the two-man flipper tanks, which never went into full production. They flipped over too often. Like many Model Ts, like Jeeps in World War II, were used by combat troops. I don't think that's the original hose on that engine there. The company had no successor to the Model T, though, when they stopped production in 1927 until the hastily designed and built Model A was introduced in December of that year. But during this slow startup, General Motors passed Ford for sales leadership in 27 and 28. The Model A, in part, and this is obviously not a standard Model A either, Henry Ford owned the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad from 1920 to 29. Here you see one of their service cars on the tracks. But it was a scaled-down Lincoln. It was believed by many, including Dr. David O. Lewis, to be pound for pound, dollar for dollar, the best automobile ever built. It enabled Ford to regain sales leadership in 1929 and 1930, but by 1931, Ford had lost, a lot of people say for good to General Motors, but I say only up to the present time. To compete more successfully, Ford introduced several cars in the 1930s, including the bread and butter V8, the first car with a single casting V8 engine, launched in 1932 and often referred to as Henry Ford's last mechanical triumph. And of course, would be known as the Little Deuce Coupe today by the Beach Boys and others. Another new model was the Lincoln Zephyr, produced between 1935 and 42 to fill the gap in the medium price field. The most important of Ford's new nameplates was the Mercury, introduced in 1938, and it filled the gap between the Ford and the Zephyr. Despite new models, the company's market share plunged from 30% in 1935 to 19% in 1941. And Henry Ford's managerial deficiencies contribute mightily to this decline, unfortunately. By the way, this is him on the radio, including all of his radio speeches. There were only 16 public speeches that Henry Ford gave, including one at Sing Sing prison, the first line of which was, "Glad to see you all here." In a sense, the Ford Motor Company had to fight not only its competitors, but also its aging leaders' outmoded ways of doing business, including too heavy a reliance on his gangster-like chief aide, Harry Bennett. Showing here with Henry Ford and Spencer Tracy at the premiere of Mr. Tracy's movie, A Man Called Edison, in 1940. Of the company's problems during the 1930s, labor was the most difficult. I mentioned before the famous Battle of the Overpass, and here you see Ruther and the others about to be attacked by UAW thugs. And of course, after a 4-year struggle, the Ford Motor Company was organized. But here you see Union thugs working over some non-striking employees that refused to join the UAW. This antagonism left a bitter legacy, and it was not until the 1980s that company-UAW relations emerged from the primitive them and us attitude, thanks considerably to the leadership of Peter Pastillo, who lives over on Provençal Road, shown here across the table from then president of the UAW, Owen Beaver. He rose to the position of vice chairman of Ford Motor Company before becoming chairman of Visteon Corporation, the firm created by the spin-off of Ford's parts operations. Ford labor-management relations have become better at this point for the first time since the teens, and fortunately have remained quite good since then. Overseas during the Great Depression, the company hung on, bolstered by such products as the Baby Ford, the Model Y, which in 1935 became the first British car to sell for less than 100 pounds. In the main, however, the company had to downsize its operations overseas during the 1930s as tariff and tax increases, import quotas, etc., made it almost impossible for multinational companies to conduct business. In Japan, the company's first assembled cars and trucks in its wooden shed, later building a plant on the Yokohama waterfront. This new plant enabled Ford to outsell all Japanese, automobile makers combined. In 1937, the company applied for a permit to manufacture as well as assemble, which they were shipped over broken down V8s. The government denied the application, saying it wanted to protect Japanese industry. Anybody guess that Japan is still a closed market today? During the late 1930s and again in the 1950s, Ford passed up chances to form joint ventures or merge with Mitsubishi, Toyota, Nissan, and in more recent years with Hyundai as well, Korean of course. Finally came the Mazda connection, which has been mutually beneficial for both. During World War II, the company engaged in war work worldwide, making products ranging from Australian-built transport barges to New Zealand-built armored cars. After the 5-mile-an-hour bumpers, I think Ford and others used this as a design study for cars in the 70s. To Canadian-built military trucks in the U.S., the company led the nation in production of gliders. Of course, the old Woody body operations in Ironwood, Michigan, and elsewhere in the Upper Peninsula, and high-powered aircraft engines were also, Ford was a leader in that market too. We had hundreds of Jeeps and armored cars and trucks, and amphibious vehicles as well. Here you see them in the boat slip at the Rouge. The public, however, identified Ford's war record almost exclusively with a Willow Run plant. Notice the L shape of this building. They were planning on making it a mile long and realized that if they did so and made it straight, it was going to go from Washtenaw County into Wayne County. And Ford didn't want to have anything to do with the politics of Wayne County at that point, so the building became L-shaped. And the B-24 bomber, the Liberator, as the English called it, was the first aircraft produced on a full-blown assembly line. Willow Run's mass production methods led to the phenomenal production of almost a bomber per hour. But in 1942 and 43, with production problems, it was nicknamed Willow Run. A month after the war ended, Henry Ford II, age 28, this is many years earlier, succeeded his 82-year-old grandfather as company president. Young Henry immediately fired Harry Bennett, then fired, demoted, or transferred more than 1,000 of Bennett's subordinates and others. This shakeup was by far the biggest in Ford history up to that time. Now, Mr. Ford and his associates also began reshaping the organization into what they called the new company. The reorganization is perhaps second in importance only to the reorganization that was attempted for Ford 2000 in the late 1990s. Block letters replaced the traditional Ford script as seen here at the top of world headquarters, which was completed in 1956. This made sense at the time, just as later it made sense for the company after establishing itself as a forward-looking firm returned in the late 1960s to the time-honored script, which, by the way, was then taken off 3 years ago. They put the Ford Motor Company in script letters onto the top of the building with the Ford blue oval, which appeared for the first time in 1927 on the front of a Model A, by the way, but that was to only be used for Ford Division. They have taken down the Ford script. This is to go up June 17th, the day after the official Centennial. During the immediate post-war period, the company poured money into new facilities, breathed new life into sales, decentralized, and above all, recruited a strong young management team. Among the recruits were the so-called whiz kids, lined up in the front row, headed by Tex Thornton, who later left Ford to become chairman of Litton Industries, and Robert McNamara to the extreme right, future Ford president and secretary of defense. Edward Lundy, second from right, a future executive vice president, who, if you go to Sacred Heart Church at Michigan Military, can still be seen there today at 10 a.m. Mass. And future president, and then later dean of the Stanford Business School at the extreme left, R.J. Miller. The most important of the new executives was Ernest Breechlow, as I mentioned before, a former General Motors executive. And he brought over a number of top GM managers, such as Lee Iacocca did when he left Ford for Chrysler Corporation. Of course, history has a way of repeating itself. In 1948, the company brought out its highly saleable 49 Fords. Here you see Benson, William Clay Ford Sr., Henry Ford II, with a model of the 49 Ford. And by 1950, they had displaced Chrysler, as they always should have been number two. Right, Herman? Anyway, Herman's 40-year retiree from Chrysler Corporation, of course. Two winners during the decade of the 1950s were the company's snappy Thunderbird, introduced in 1955, and the Falcon, launched in 1959. The Falcon helped blunt the first invasion of foreign cars, and of course the chassis for this car became the first Mustang. Although the company had winners, it also introduced the Edsel, a word now defined in most dictionaries as a definition for a colossal mistake, and the colossal mistake was naming it after Edsel Ford, the first in my mind. This is the main rose garden at the Henry Ford estate. The Edsel has been associated with President, I love this picture, Nixon. This is something that Dr. David L. Lewis gave me. If you look carefully, Vice President Nixon is riding in and waving from an Edsel in Caracas, Venezuela, underneath a BVD underwear sign. The company paid dearly to meet safety and emissions regulations introduced in the U.S. in 1966. Much regulation would have been avoided or brought about much less expensively if the industry had voluntarily expanded on Ford's safety innovations in the mid-1950s. They had seatbelts for 2 or 3 years and nobody wanted them. They were removed later on. Instead, the industry, assuming that safety didn't sell, dragged its feet and left the government to get the job done, and it did so with a vengeance, as we all know it. it's a history lesson that the industry has taken to heart and in recent years has played a part in the improvement rather than awaiting public pressure and government mandates for safety. Today at last, safety sells. Customers want airbags, even side airbags now, anti-lock brakes as well, and still government regulation remains Ford and the industry's major concern. California and other states now are pressuring the industry to go after electric cars, and here we see Ford's Ectostar light electric delivery van of the early 1990s. During the 1960s, the company introduced several new models, most notably the Mustang, which set a record for first-year sales and gave its name to a generation. A decade later, Ford talked about abandoning, about a decade ago now, Ford talked about abandoning the Mustang for the Probe. Thank God it didn't. But the Mustang has made a good comeback, and its future seems assured with a new model coming out next year, for at least the next 5 years, with its move from the Rouge to the Flat Rock. Hopefully this will not affect quality. Imported cars had 15% of the market. Boy, what a dream that would be today by 1973, and it would have been more if it had not been for cars like the Maverick, one of the first subcompacts introduced in 1969. My sister bought one of these from Royal Bryan, out the door with a vinyl top and AM radio, 3 on the tree for $19.95, with tax and license, as a matter of fact, and followed by the Pinto, one of the first mini cars in 1970, which was really quite successful, and by the end, they had corrected the explosion problem. We won't go into that. In the 1980s, the Lincoln Town Car, downsized, but still a land yacht compared to most other cars, was a surprise success and continues to be a moneymaker. And the F1 truck, which is now over 50 years old, rode high as America's best-selling vehicle as it has been for much of the period since the late 1960s, and it's also been very, very profitable. The Escort, although not a moneymaker, became the world's best-selling nameplate in the 1980s. The Taurus Sable symbolized the company's great comeback in the 1980s and became the industry's best-selling car until the second-generation egg-shaped car, Taurus, took it to third place. In the 1990s, the Explorer has been the company's biggest winner, a very profitable vehicle, and has remained so despite the Firestone fiasco. The Windstar van is also, minivan has done very well, and after a long delay, you may have seen the new Mercury version on the roads for 2004. This new model and the Freestar that will replace it next year will give Ford a chance to become minivan leader, something that it definitely would have been if Henry Ford II hadn't fired Hal Sperlich in the 1980s. With him, the idea for the minivan went to Chrysler Corporation, where Lee Iacocca and Sperlich and others built the first one and have led ever since. All of these cars reflect the company's greatly increased commitment to improve quality beginning in the 1980s. Much of this quality gain was lost under the cost-cutting measures instituted by Jack Nasser, though. The first half of the 1980s were also a depression in the automobile industry, followed in the mid-1980s by record profits, lost again in the early 1990s, and an incredible comeback until the last couple of years. This period has also seen some of the largest acquisitions and spin-offs in Ford's history, including the purchase of Jaguar, Aston Martin seen here. Have you driven a $225,000 Ford lately? Volvo and Land Rover. Today the company contemplates the purchase, I should say, of these luxury brands. It should point to Lincoln as a great acquisition at $8.5 million plus $4 million in debt, a far cry from the $6 billion plus they paid for Volvo a few years ago. The company has also purchased First Nationwide Bank, Hertz, USL Capital, and the Associates, although they've sold First Nationwide and the Associates since. Meanwhile, it sold long-held tractor division, steel, shipping. And a final word about the company's overseas business. Ford hoped to sell 100,000 cars in Japan by the year 2000, among them the right-hand drive Mustang that we see here today. The company continues to sell very few vehicles in this largely closed market. During the 1980s, Ford resumed business in China. This photo showing Henry Ford II had left, and China's leader Deng Xiaoping here at the Ford's Atlanta plant in 1978. During the last decade, the company has opened dealerships again in China and has negotiated for several parts making ventures and an effort to win a chance to build cars in China, which finally happened in late 2002. The company has also made a push into India, one of its top priorities, and is now assembling cars there and has moved much of CAD/CAM, computer-aided design, computer-aided manufacturing work to this country. So now the Americans can pass the work off, I should say the Europeans can pass the work off to the Americans, who can then pass it off to the people working in India. And so you have design work 24 hours a day as a result. Also, Ford planned to expand significantly into South America In Brazil and Argentina, the company has had its ups and downs with the economies of these countries. And Autolatina, a joint venture with Volkswagen in Brazil, unfortunately did not succeed. So much for the short history course on the Ford Motor Company. Today the company faces tremendous competitive pressures all over the world. And it was only 3 years ago that it seemed like the company was destined to pass General Motors to become #1 automobile producer in the world. Still, in less than a month, the company will celebrate its centennial, although we will not know for sure where the Ford Motor Company will end up in the decades to come. It is surely to be one of the largest and most successful auto firms on earth. 5 years ago, Edsel Ford II, only son of Henry Ford II and Ford Motor Company director, retired from his position as president of Ford Motor Credit Company at age 50. Since doing so, he has led a tremendous number of philanthropic projects. In addition to his great work for juvenile diabetes, he's also led Detroit's 300 celebration in 2002. Let's hope the Ford Motor Company celebration can be as grand. On July 18th, by the way, he will receive the Detroit Historical Society's Heritage Award in recognition of his contribution to the preservation of southeastern Michigan's rich heritage. This work is indicative of the charitable works performed by so many of the family members, whether it be Henry Ford I and the Edison Institute, the living wage and jobs for minorities and physically challenged, the car that put the world on wheels, the Henry Ford health system, and on and on and on. Or Edsel Ford I, the Diego Rivera murals, the Detroit Institute of Arts. I led a tour down there and called their research library a couple of years ago and said, would it be possible to fax me a list of the donations made by Edsel and Eleanor Ford? And the young lady who I knew in the research library called me back at my office about a half hour later and said, Mike, can I mail it to you? There's 539 items, it's 43 pages long. Henry Ford II, of course, the Renaissance Center, inner city hiring efforts, Josephine Ford, her donations to the DIA, the College for Creative Studies, and so on. Here you see 12 of the 13 great-grandchildren. Lynn Ford in the center with her eyes closed next to the nanny has done so much in a variety of charities. William Clay Ford Jr., seen with the green pants on. Edsel Ford II hates this picture, by the way. Of course, bringing the Lions back downtown and building Ford Field. And on and on and on, including the creation of the Ford Foundation I mentioned earlier, which has given away over $12 billion over the year. This set the stage for the long-term family control of the company with the creation of B-Stock, which means with less than 10% of the stock in the company, the family still controls 40.5% of the voting stock. And I would argue this has been a great thing in light of the Daimler purchase of Chrysler, and so much else has gone on in the auto industry for southeastern Michigan. As Jeff Daniels put it last month at the black tie dinner for the Fairlane estate at the new truck plant, when he was shooting 101 Dalmatians in London, he passed Buckingham Palace and was told that's where royalty lived. But tonight, meaning that night, he had met Edsel Ford II and he had met real royalty. All of us in southeastern Michigan owe a great debt to our royal family, the Ford family. Thank you very much.